or the Superfund law. And so, once again, reminder, there is strict, joint and several, and retroactive liability for all response costs for any potentially responsible party, right? And we talked about who all those are, a lot of different possibilities. It doesn't depend on negligence, intent, or harm. And we talked about that there are various defenses, acts of God, or third parties, divisibility, small contributors, and these are de minimis and de micrimis settlements that are authorized, specifically where small contributors can pay and buy themselves out of their liability, and also particular exemptions for small generators of municipal solid waste. There are defenses for lenders who merely hold a security interest in the property and are not involved in management or decision-making regarding the property. If the lender forecloses on the property, now they're an owner. If the lender is involved in telling the often financially shaky owner what they should or shouldn't be doing with their property, now the lender becomes a PRP. Okay, so of course lenders try to stay in the safe harbor of merely holding the security interest. And then finally, we had just left off with talking about the innocent landowner or purchaser defense. And this is basically for any purchaser or landowner of the land who did not contribute any way to the contamination, that the waste was there before they purchased the land, and they had no knowledge or reason to know. Okay, so no actual notice or constructive notice of the potential for it to be contaminated. Okay, so in order for a landowner to qualify, the landowner first has to arrange for a phase one, which is, and it has to be done by somebody who is qualified or certified to do this. That used to not be the case. All sorts of people did these, and so the EPA cracked down and they said you now have to have special training and expertise to do this. Okay, and so the expert, the sort of certified expert with a phase one will do an investigation of the site's history. So they'll look at all the title records. They'll look at maps so that show the history. So one of the sources that's out there is something called Sanborn maps. Sanborn maps were maps that were done for insurance companies back in the early part of the 20th century. So the early to mid 1900s, these maps were done. They show exactly what particular uses were on each property. It generally showed the property dimension, the dimensions and location of structures, what they were made out of, all these kinds of things that insurance companies cared about, right? They, was it a wood structure that was used as a bakery? Obviously, that's high risk for an insurance company, et cetera, that kind of thing. But what that tells you, and I've had students here do Sanborn map research before as public service for nonprofits that were acquiring property, and the point here is that you're looking for things that are, if it says foundry or rubber manufacturing or gas station, those are things that are going to tell you that the property is very likely to have some sort of contamination. So you do all of this investigation. Then you also have to actually go out and physically walk the property, inspect it, take a look. Does it look like it? There's big drums and they're rusting and they look like they may be leaking. Obviously, that should tell you that there's potential for hazardous waste contamination. So the phase one will tell you then whether you need to do further testing, and that's phase two. And phase two involves things like soil samples and groundwater samples, groundwater monitoring, and that kind of thing, where you're trying to determine, is there any contamination of the property? If so, how much? What kind of contamination? And so forth. Okay, so there are two concepts here. First of all, that a landowner or purchaser has to engage in all appropriate inquiry in order to have the defense. So that has been interpreted to mean phase one, and if phase one suggests that there might be any potential problems, then you have to do a phase two, and they are deemed to be on constructive notice of any sort of information that could be discovered that way. Obviously, if you actually know that the site is contaminated or potentially contaminated, then you don't get the innocent landowner or purchaser defense either. Okay? So, and this is important stuff. It's important stuff in real estate practice and environmental practice and land use and land development, all of these areas. This drives decisions about whether or not to purchase property. It drives the value of property. So obviously, if phase ones are leading to determinations that phase twos are necessary, okay, at that point, many purchasers will just back out of the transaction. They'll want their deposit, their earnest money or down payment back, and they will want to void the contract altogether and go find a different property. So you can imagine that if the property has anything in that phase one would indicate could potentially lead or could potentially suggest contamination, that the value of that property is suddenly very low, because you're not going to find many purchasers that are willing to take on potentially unlimited liability. And as we talked about earlier, last class period, these cleanups are often in the millions of dollars. And so, you don't want to pay, $500,000 for a piece of property that then you're going to turn around and develop. But before you can develop it, you have to spend several millions of dollars in order to clean it up. Okay? So that's the issue there. Among PRPs, it is possible for either the court or the court, if there's litigation, or the EPA, if there's an EPA supervised cleanup, to adopt equitable apportionment standards. Okay? So that is possible. When I was in practice, I practiced law in San Antonio. I represented a couple of different companies that were small contributors. Well, they ended up being classified as small contributors. They were PRPs, and they got notices, and they contacted me, and they said, "What the hell is this?" And I said, "Okay, get out your checkbook." I talked them through all this. But then I contacted. And actually, I think in both cases there was a major contributor, a major PRP that was sort of overseeing the whole cleanup. And in both cases, they were well represented by big law firms. And so I would contact the lawyers and basically negotiate my client down to a de minimis or de micrimis settlement. And a lot of times, because I had small clients, these were small businesses. One was a chemical manufacturing company. It was a small operation. And so basically, obviously, if we're PRP, we're going to be liable. But basically, what I did is I negotiated them down to the lowest category possible based on the amount that we generated, and usually was able to get an agreement that we could pay over time. So that it was a cash flow issue for the company, and I'm not sure that it was really impossible for the company to afford to pay immediately, but basically I got them basically installment payments over time. With no interest installment payments over time, which was worked out pretty well. One of the things that should tell you is you should always plan on learning and developing negotiation skills while you're in law school as much as possible, and if not then soon after you get out of practice, because you will use negotiation skills in every kind of practice possible. Okay, so and my clients ended up being very happy with what I did for them. So negotiation skills are important. The point of all this is to avoid taxpayer-funded cleanups. Put the responsibility on the PRPs, but the realities are that really it's only going to be financially solvent PRPs that end up really paying. So the ones that are out of business, bankrupt, etc., of course, are off the hook. And of course, as I mentioned just a moment ago, there is very little incentive for a new owner to buy the property and come in and clean it up. So what happens is that it often just languishes. The property just remains unremediated and remains contaminated. And we end up actually spending a huge amount of money. So the total amount of dollars spent in the CERCLA arena, a vast amount of them, those dollars, are spent on litigation and process as opposed to actual cleanup. Now, there's lots of money that gets spent on cleanup, but just you would imagine that it would be an overwhelming. Most of the money should be spent on cleanup. That's not true. Actually, a lot of money gets spent on lawyers, on litigation, on costs associated with just sort of figuring out, or even a PRP, what's going to happen and so forth. CERCLA became, though, the object of an important passage of new environmental law in 2002. It's the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act. Okay. You can imagine the politics in Congress of putting small business in anything. Everybody loves to be for small business, right? Doesn't really matter who which political party or whatnot. It's just there's good politics behind saying you did something for small business. But the bottom line here, and so part of this was small businesses are sort of being disproportionately adversely affected by CERCLA because they are the least of all the businesses out there. They're the least able to comply. And by the way, we talked about this earlier, but just the basic residential landowner is not liable under CERCLA, right? So if you don't go freaking out now when you go buy a house. Then now you have to do a phase 1 and phase 2. Now I would encourage you not to buy a house that was a chemical manufacturing facility site. There's a whole lot of reasons why you shouldn't do that, right? But don't freak out about that. But in the business world, small businesses end up having less money to afford all these costs. And so this was meant to create more incentives, more funding for brownfields cleanup, better processes, faster processes for approving cleanups, and so on and so forth. So we've seen some improvement there. So this is our last slide. Remember, brownfields are not only contaminated sites, but sites that are perceived to be at risk of being contaminated. And the barriers here are fear of liability, and so lenders, purchasers, and developers do not want to engage in to taking on that liability. But and so how do we encourage voluntary cleanup? Well, one is funding. So the Brownfields Revitalization Act provided some new authority for new funding, liability relief, and so forth. With brownfields, there are questions about what the cleanup standards are going to be. The ARORs, we talked about that. But again, the Brownfields Act provided some relief there, and the public participation in cleanup plans and enforcement is still required and is still important. Some of what's going on here is some tension between these brownfield sites just sitting contaminated and unused, and that inhibits economic development, jobs, property values, and economic vitality of low-income communities of color. On the other hand, one of the issues here is that you also have sort of continued, also with that is if it remains unremediated, you have continued exposure to pollutants and health risks. One of the problems, though, is with some of this standards relief, relief on ARORs, relief on liability, there is some evidence that we're getting disparate cleanup standards and outcomes. So as you might imagine, there is tremendous political pressure and maybe even to some degree some economic pressure that if the brownfield is in a higher income neighborhood or near a higher income neighborhood, near a white neighborhood, it gets better cleanup than if it is in a less politically active or less politically powerful minority neighborhood or low income neighborhood. Okay? So those are some of the issues going on with brownfields and environmental justice. Questions? All right. So let me do this. So now what we do is we're turning to environmental justice itself, and part of what I wanted to do was to have this visible on the board so that you can see all of it at one time rather than go, it's hard to go back and forth between slides on the PowerPoint. So I'm going to cover 7 sort of issues here. What is environmental justice? Looking at environmental justice as a set of phenomena of things that are happening in the world, in communities. Then I want to, actually I'm going to probably hit the EPA definition earlier, but I just put it up there to reiterate the EPA definition, talk about the laws that are relevant to environmental justice, and then come to environmental justice as a movement, outcomes on environmental justice, and sort of thinking beyond environmental law, which will not at all be surprising, both based on the reading and based on things we've done in other classes. So the EPA defined environmental justice is the fair and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that definition gets thrown around a lot. It's actually a pretty narrow definition in some ways because it basically talks about the development of laws, regulations, and policies. It doesn't really talk at all about implementation or enforcement. It doesn't really address things that are related to environmental. It doesn't really tell you what when we talk about environmental. Obviously, the EPA's involvement in low-income neighborhoods of color is a much narrower involvement than if you look at a whole variety of governmental and non-governmental entities across things like land use and transportation and public facilities and so forth. So we talk all about that. And one of the things is that obviously environmental justice is, in this particular case, is defined in the positive. What are we trying to achieve here? We're trying to achieve fairness, equity, and it's got, in particular, we're concerned about fairness and equity for all racial groups, all ethnic groups, and all socioeconomic classes of people. So that's, and that's a significant part of environmental justice. But sometimes when we're talking about environmental justice, what we're really doing is we're talking about a phenomenon where we're paying attention to or giving attention to environmental injustice, the fact that there has historically been a lot of injustices. A lot of people sort of think about the 1980s as the real start of the environmental justice movement. But in reality, there were a lot of grassroots efforts and activism concerning environmental and land use conditions in low-income communities and communities of color, black communities, Latino communities, and so forth, well before the 1980s. Okay? And some people like to even identify a couple of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in as having environmental justice components. Nonetheless, it's sort of generally acknowledged that the first awareness of this on a real national level in terms of the sort of national attention was the protests in Warren County, North Carolina, primarily black, primarily low-income community that already had a bunch of waste facilities and had been selected out of all the counties in North Carolina for to be a hazardous waste facility to receive hazardous waste, particularly PCBs. And if anybody knows PCBs, they're pretty bad stuff. We use them in for like electric utility poles and electric utility transformers, but they're very highly carcinogenic. Don't even ask me to tell you what the chemical name is for PCB. If I had looked it up before class, I could tell you, but just off the top of my head, it's bad carcinogenic stuff. And so part of what happened is the residents sort of really organized, became very frustrated, connected with some civil rights groups and so forth, and ended up doing things like laying down in the road to stop the trucks from coming through. That's obviously very dramatic. Anything that's dramatic, whether it's, for example, the Cuyahoga River catching fire or people lying down in the road to stop PCB-laden waste from coming to their community, it gets on the national news. And so that really brought some attention to the idea that there's not equal environmental conditions and not equal treatment of policies, regulations, and laws across all races and ethnicities and socioeconomic classes. Then the next year, the General Accounting Office, the GAO, did a report looking at patterns of citing various environmental hazards and environmental waste and so forth. And then just a few years after that, the United Church of Christ did a major report, a very systematic study, and both of these got a lot of attention. And so that started getting people's attention. I'm going to go ahead and jump to 1990, and I'll come back to 89 in just a moment. So another big study was done by an African-American sociologist who at the time was based, I think, in Houston, either Houston or New Orleans. He's actually taught in a number of places. He taught in Atlanta for a while. But Dr. Robert Bullard had started with a book called Dumping in Dixie, and he basically started doing a whole series of studies and books on what he started out with environmental racism. He talked about the term environmental racism, and he showed how low-income black communities were disproportionately targeted for these kinds of, whether it's landfills or hazardous waste sites and so forth. And then, so he's written a whole bunch of different books and so forth. And he calls himself the father of environmental justice, but he's clearly a very influential person spoken here and so forth. But his studies brought some sort of academic credence to what was going on. The next thing I'm going to focus on is in 1992, then a variety of grassroots groups came together for the first People of Color Environmental Summit, and they adopted 17 principles that were very broad. And by the way, these groups are all from all over the U.S. They involve black communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, Native American tribes, very significant. And there's a sort of whole discussion of things like colonialism and genocide and some of those kinds of things that were viewed as part of sort of this history of environmental harm to different groups and so forth. So that, but what happened out of this is, for the most part, a lot of these were very grassroots community-based, and what was now forming was a big national network. So still grassroots-based, but the movement itself became, in some ways, a national movement, or a national network of local movements. Also in 1992, in the first Bush administration, there was, within the EPA, an Office of Environmental Equity that was created. Okay? Then there have been a variety of other, sort of environmental justice conflicts that got a lot of attention. One in 1989, so still before the summit, there was a hazardous waste incinerator proposed for Kettleman City, California. It is a place that is primarily Latino, primarily Spanish-speaking, and primarily migrant farm workers. Okay? And the board of supervisors, which is sort of like with our fiscal court here, the decision makers for Kettleman County had selected the part, I forget what the county was named, but anyway, whatever for that county, they had selected the area that was low-income Latino, as opposed to the other part of the county, which was primarily white and people who were owned the farms and the businesses and so forth. And so there was a hearing at the fairgrounds. Okay, so you can imagine fairgrounds, big, huge arena and so forth, and so it's a vast arena, and the decision makers, government officials, were all up on some stage behind a table sitting and so forth, and they were hearing all this testimony and all this information about the environmental impacts of this hazardous waste incinerator, and the residents who were going to be living near it wanted that translated in Spanish, and so the official said, well, you have to go back to the far corner of the arena, long ways from where the actual decision making was happening, where the actual speaking was happening, and they had some folding chair with a translator there. And so obviously the imagery of that, being sort of sent back to the corner of the room, far away from the decision making and the information and the power, was a pretty stark contrast. And so they sued, challenging the environmental impact process. And one of the things is they were claiming that the environmental impact report needed to be in Spanish. Well, the trial court ended up not deciding that issue, but what they did say is that the environmental impact report was in such complicated technical language that it was inaccessible to everyday members of the public, and the whole point of the environmental impact report is to inform not only the decision makers but also the public about the environmental impacts. And so it ended up being that then the company just decided to withdraw its application, because obviously they're going to have to go back and do another environmental impact report. So that tells you something about sort of how that NEPA process works and how it can ultimately if there's litigation over it, it can ultimately kill a proposal. Also, then in 1996, there were a couple other controversies. One was Shintech, a PVC manufacturing facility, actually from Taiwan, and they proposed to place a manufacturing facility in Convent, Louisiana. And Convent, Louisiana is extremely low income and very high, extremely high proportion of black people, and it is in what is called Cancer Alley, which is along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And it is a place which was actually along there was where people before the Civil War who were slaves lived, and then after the Civil War, former slaves, and it's very just very economically depressed. And so they're going to put this there. This is called Cancer Alley because there are so many chemical, industrial, and petroleum facilities there that the air pollution is quite high along there, and the cancer rates are quite high in the area. And so this is an interesting example because the community was very divided. So the NAACP came in to try to organize the community against it, but then there were people who were like, hey, we want this because it's going to give us jobs. And so there was some tension there. The students at Tulane Law School in New Orleans took this on as part of their environmental law clinic, and they challenged it. And very interestingly, the air permit for this particular facility under the Clean Air Act was going to be granted, or was granted, by the state Environmental Protection Department, under authority delegated by the US EPA. So we talked about that before in the context of the Clean Water Act, right? But you get these permits that are federal permits, but the state environmental agency has the authority to receive the applications and do the review and grant the permits according to the federal regulatory standards. Well, this was challenged. A good example of law students paying close attention in environmental law, they challenged it first within the appeal process within the EPA, because as you all know, you have to exhaust your administrative remedies first, right? You see there's just the clear application of that rule. So they knew that. They knew they had exhausted administrative remedies, so they appealed it within the EPA, and the EPA administrator overturned the state agency's grant of the permit for failure to consider cumulative and synergistic impacts. So the state had only considered the direct impacts of this particular proposed facility and had not considered how its air emissions would interact with or add to all of the effects of all the other facilities in the area. So presumably the idea is, if each one of these is analyzed separately, they may all have relatively low thresholds, but when you have so many all concentrated in this one area together, that ends up being harmful to human health. So what happened is Shintech then stepped away. They said, we're not going to locate here in Convent. They went up to northern Louisiana, sort of near Shreveport, and decided to build a facility in a middle class, probably maybe working class, light community with significantly better environmental controls than what they proposed in Convent. So they, so the facility that they ended up bringing and the jobs they ended up bringing were less environmentally impactful on the white community there. This also led to the governor putting pressure on the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court of Louisiana, to revoke the limited license ability of the law students at the Tulane Law Clinic to bring these kinds of lawsuits. And so their professor left, and the whole clinic kind of languished for a while. And finally, they figured something out in the long run, but it basically was but the governor was very unhappy that here was this company that was being sort of not allowed to locate in Convent. Chester, Pennsylvania, so this is in the Philadelphia area. One of the things to point out here is not all, so between Kettleman City and Chester, actually even Convent, okay, none of these three areas are the urban core, okay? None of them are, we're not talking about West Louisville or, Harlem, New York, or that kind of thing. We're talking about communities that are somehow, outside of sort of central urban areas. Chester, Pennsylvania is in the Philadelphia area, but it is on the outskirts, and it is primarily black, it is very low income, and it is a place that has, I can't remember off the top of my head, I should look it up before class, but it's a ridiculous number of landfills. Okay, they have all of these solid waste sites that have somehow just located in Chester, Pennsylvania. So as you might imagine, anybody who's going to open a new landfill says, "Ah, Chester, that's the place to do it. There's a whole bunch of them there," right, and so forth. And so again, they pushed back. There was a lawsuit, and it looked possibly like the U.S. Supreme Court might end up taking this case to push back on the idea that disparate impact could be a legitimate consideration, right? So one of the things that we're going to get to in equal protection is, in order to maintain a claim on the basis of equal protection, you have to show intent to discriminate on the basis of race. And but what happened is ultimately the Pennsylvania Supreme Court took this, and then eventually the Pennsylvania Department of the Environment ended up rejecting this particular waste site proposal. One of the big concerns was the cumulative effects of more and more traffic, truck traffic, heavy truck traffic, bringing all of that garbage, all that landfill waste to them. So some examples of how environmental justice emerged and evolved. Then in 1994, we saw some really significant federal action. President Clinton adopted Executive Order 12898, also created an Office of Environmental Justice, and also the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is called NEJAC. Okay? The Executive Order is probably the one thing that gets most of our attention, and this is it up here with obviously some editing, but it says, to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law, each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by identifying and addressing disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. So now, by virtue of executive order, all federal agencies were basically ordered to consider environmental justice in how they went about their activities, how they implemented programs and policies, adopted regulations, etc. There are at least a couple of federal appellate cases that say that there is no private cause of action for enforcement of the executive order. Right? So just let's think a little bit about the APA. Right? The APA is about challenging a government action that is a couple things is if the government takes an action that is arbitrary and capricious, an abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with the law, right, it can be challenged. And secondly, if they fail to take a non-discretionary action, that it can be challenged. But the courts have said, executive orders are not the kind of law that a third party can have standing to bring a claim to say, hey, the agency didn't follow the executive order. Okay? So no cause of action to enforce the executive order or to complain that the agency hasn't done what it's supposed to. However, there are a number of different ways in which environmental justice considerations have been brought into different considerations of RCRA permitting, into setting the water quality standards. Right? When we're talking about water quality standards under the EPA, you can consider impacts on vulnerable populations in doing that, and of course in NEPA, you can obviously when you're looking at the ecological, aesthetic, historic, cultural, economic, or health impacts of major federal actions, including cumulative impacts, you can pay special attention to populations that are disproportionately affected or that are especially vulnerable. Okay? So that's the EPA. I'm just also going to mention briefly that the vast majority of states, more than 2/3 of the states, have some sort of laws, policies, or regulations that directly address environmental justice. Okay, but don't get carried away with that. Many of them are sort of broad and aspirational. They don't provide a lot of hard law that is enforceable in court. But nonetheless, there has been some state attention, and there have been in some states state courts that have given special attention to adverse environmental impacts of decisions and permits and so forth on low-income communities of color. So the states where that has happened the most are, not surprisingly, California and New York, but also New Mexico. All of those states have statutes that tend to be more protective of communities, vulnerable populations, and to require more environmental analysis than the typical state would. So just so you're aware of that. Okay, so what are we talking about? We've given you a number of examples. Let's look at the kind of phenomena that, so the heart of environmental justice has to do with the typical sort of environmental harms to human health or the human environment. Hazardous waste facilities, TSD facilities, okay? Disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color. Solid waste facilities, landfills, we talked about that. Toxic chemicals more generally, so exposure to toxics. So for example, hexavalent chromium, very bad stuff. Okay, it's cancer, carcinogenic, cancer-causing. Also causes things like nosebleeds and headaches and stuff like that. Okay, there is a disproportionate number of facilities with hexavalent that emit or use hexavalent chromium near or even immediately adjacent to schools, elementary schools, where lower-income kids and minority kids go to school in California. Okay, this is a California study, and so that's an exposure to those sorts of toxics. Air pollution, air quality in general. So again, there are lots of models of this, but we know for sure that the air quality in West Louisville is substantially worse, substantially more harmful to human health than in the eastern suburbs, right? And we have good evidence of that, or clear evidence of that, and that's true in lots of places. There's been studies in Los Angeles and San Diego, other places. Water pollution, disproportionate exposure to water pollution. Now, water pollution can happen in lots of places. A lot of water is not stationary, so presumably, like for example, red algae blooms in the Ohio River are going to affect a range of communities upstream and downstream. But one of the particular issues that came up early in the environmental justice movement had to do with mercury that bioaccumulates in fish. Okay, and the federal standards for how much mercury is permissible in aquatic environments because of its bioaccumulation was based on a set of assumptions about consumption of fish. And it basically said, I think if I remember correctly, it was 2 servings of fish a week. Okay, well, all right. So already I've gotten some of your attention because some of you have more than that a week because that's your choice of diet. But also it clearly that standard was clearly exposing lower income people who engage in subsistence fishing, who go out and bring home the evening meal from fishing. Okay, so when I lived in San Antonio, Texas, okay, you go down so not in the part of the San Antonio River where the Riverwalk is. You guys been to the Riverwalk? You should, right? It's nice. It's touristy. Lots you can sit out and drink your margaritas, eat your enchiladas and chips and salsa while the little touristy boats go up and down the river, and there's like a mariachi band and so forth. Right? Very nice. Okay, but if you go south of town, okay, where the San Antonio River kind of opens up, is a little bit more wild. Okay, you see all kinds of lower income Latino, not exclusively men, but at the time it was sort of more men than women out there fishing for the meal to take home for dinner. So what you got with that is then greater exposure to mercury if you are, say, for example, a Latino kid in a low-income neighborhood where somebody in your family's out there bringing home more fish out of the San Antonio River. Okay, so pesticides. Okay, pesticides are a problem. And yes, you probably have some general vague awareness that if you put a lot of bad chemicals on your lawn, that you're exposing yourself. You ought to be wearing some sort of protective clothing. But think about if you are a migrant farm worker and you are regularly exposed to pesticides all the time. Okay, so that's been an issue. Siting of facilities. So we are talking about all kinds of facilities that might have environmental impacts, whether it's Shintech or the hazardous waste incinerator or the landfills or whatnot. But also siting of facilities that we call LULUs. LULUs are locally unwanted land uses, and so they may be things that are not for example, what we sort of think of as pollution generating, but it can have a serious impact. So one of the big issues going on in West Louisville right now has to do with things like group homes, halfway houses, rehabilitation facilities, and so forth, where you're getting a whole bunch all in a concentrated area. And that sort of issue is more appropriate for the land use class I'm teaching in the spring, but again, it's an issue that comes up. And then what are the standards, conditions, and processes for granting or denying permits? And we talked about that at various times. But for example, one of the things that we saw in authorization of cleanups for under Superfund is the relaxing of the ARARs, right? The relaxing of the requirements or conditions of the cleanup, and we have more relaxation happening in low-income neighborhoods of color than in higher-income neighborhoods. Okay, so we know, for example, with Superfund cleanups. Actually, let's just go ahead and put that up there too. That we know that often they take longer to actually happen in low-income and minority neighborhoods, and the cleanup is often less. Okay, it's less cleaned up. There's more community exposure to ongoing hazardous substances in Superfund brownfield cleanups, and there's been a whole variety of studies and documentation of that. Okay? Second area of sort of environmental justice is where I've done a lot of my research and writing and work and so forth has to do with sort of thinking about land use as an environmental justice issue. So again, we talked about LULUs and facilities with environmental impacts, but also low-income neighborhoods of color are disproportionately zoned for industrial uses. I did a empirical studies or systematic empirical study where I looked at 31 census tracts in 7 cities across the U.S. This was back in 1998, my kind of first big piece trying to get tenure, which apparently I got because I'm still here. You haven't gotten rid of me yet, and so forth. And what I found, which was not at all surprising, is that the census tracts that were low-income, high minority were way more zoned for industrial uses than the high-income, low-minority census tracts. Okay, not at all surprising, but nobody had ever really documented that, and so forth. But one of the things I found is very often the industrial facilities were immediately next door or directly across the street from residences. Okay, so it's not just kind of in the area, but we're talking about significant exposure. Obviously, here in Louisville, Rubbertown is an example of industrial land uses in close proximity to low-income and minority neighborhoods. Lack of equal public services, facilities, and infrastructure. Okay? So let me sort of break that down into 3 parts. So one piece is there was a time where, and there still are a few places around the country that this is still true, where there were, in a city, there were low-income minority neighborhoods that had no paved streets, they had no running water, they had no sewer service, right? I mean, that's shocking, right? It's shocking. And these were cases where actually the court said intentional racial discrimination has been proved because there can be no reason why every neighborhood in the city has paved streets, running water, and sewer system except for this black neighborhood, or this Latino neighborhood. Okay, so that was I mean that's a Gickwell versus Hopkins analysis, right? Everybody follow me who's had con law too? Yes, no? Okay, so basically the idea here is that intentional discrimination can be determined by the court just on the face of the pattern of behavior of the government action if there's no explanation other than the fact that it's racially motivated. Okay, right? So there were a number of cases, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, where the Supreme Court, or not Supreme Court, the courts were holding that was going on. Even after that, so back when I was practicing in San Antonio, and this was true, you had places in Texas, in sort of South Texas, not far from the U.S.-Mexico border, that were what we call colonias. They were unincorporated parts of counties where there was no zoning or planning. Okay, so there's no county authority for zoning and planning in Texas. And so these were areas outside of city limits where developers would come in and they would build a bunch of low-cost, low-income housing without streets, running water, sewer, electricity, etc. Okay, it was third world conditions in the U.S. And so that was an example. But sort of generally more systematically across many cities in the U.S., lower-income neighborhoods of color end up having less in the way of parks, other kinds of open space or green infrastructure, trees, transportation facilities, public transportation, sidewalks. A lot of times the sidewalks aren't, either don't exist or aren't well maintained. So a whole variety of infrastructure that and facilities and services that exist in neighborhoods that are not highly minority or that are not especially low income, and yet not in low income and minority neighborhoods. Built infrastructure can be more vulnerable in low income neighborhoods of color, less in the way of systematic transportation planning and options, but also more high impact traffic. So freeways and so forth that go through low income and minority neighborhoods, or again landfills where the plan is to put the heavy truck traffic through those neighborhoods. And then finally, we've talked a little bit about this. Another land use issue is gentrification and displacement. Okay? The idea that these neighborhoods are particularly vulnerable to being flipped, and the people who live there end up being displaced because they can no longer afford to live there. It becomes fancy schmancy. All right. Third category of environmental justice issues have to do with process. So environmental impact assessments that may or may not consider the particular impacts on sort of justice impacts, low-income populations, minority populations, etc. Failure to consider cumulative and synergistic risks and impacts. Barriers to participation, inclusion, and empowerment. We've talked about this previously, but just kind of reiterate the who gets to participate, who gets to make the decision, when do those meetings occur, how are they being done, what kind of language, what kind of resources do you need to have, what kind of knowledge and information, what are the decision standards by which decisions are going to be made. Another area that is an environmental justice area has to do with enforcement. So government agencies enforcing environmental laws with administrative, civil, and criminal penalties or actions of different sorts. We saw that, we studied that way back, and so forth. So the question is, are there disparities in terms of how long it takes for something to be enforced, the penalties that are charged, the opportunities of the residents to participate, the outcomes, and I'll talk about SEPs in just a moment. Okay? So there was a study back in kind of this time frame in here, when the environmental justice movement was really getting going, was done by the National Law Journal, and they found that there were significant disparities in EPA enforcement. The study, it turns out, was deeply flawed methodologically. Okay? So there were a variety of subsequent studies that basically what happened is they just put communities in quartiles, or quintiles, I forget which it was, but anyway, but they had these big groupings, and they also, their database about enforcement actions was incomplete, and so on and so forth. So it actually turns out that while there are concerns in environmental justice communities and low-income communities and communities of color about whether enforcement is actually going to happen, it turns out that the more rigorous studies have shown that sometimes the penalties are significantly higher or the outcomes are significantly better in low-income neighborhoods and or in minority neighborhoods. Although you have to have a really sort of long period of study in order to find those patterns. There are time periods where it seems like maybe there's under-enforcement in those neighborhoods, but then there's other times when there's sort of rather rigorous enforcement. SEPs are supplemental environmental projects. Okay? Supplemental environmental projects are where the polluter or whoever is violating the environmental laws pays less of a civil or administrative fine and instead funds environmental projects within the community, okay, within the community. And so the idea is to get, instead of money just going into the U.S. Treasury, it actually gets out to the community to improve environmental projects. Historically, a lot of low-income neighborhoods of color were not as plugged in to that SEP process. Seem to maybe not be as aware of the potential, but that has improved over time. So SEPs now have become a way to address some of the environmental injustices. And then finally, citizen suits and judicial review. So there is definitely the case that environmental justice groups or grassroots groups in communities that are disproportionately affected bring citizen suits under various laws, including especially federal environmental laws, and seek judicial review of either agency action or of actions by polluters or other regulated parties. Okay. Last thing I want to hit here is environmental justice also involves disproportionate vulnerabilities. So disproportionate vulnerabilities include vulnerabilities of particular populations. So I mentioned before, people who actually consume the fish they catch in a higher proportion than the average are more vulnerable. But there are a whole variety of elderly, people with disabilities, people with medical conditions, etc. There are neighborhood vulnerabilities. Okay? Neighborhoods can, there are neighborhoods that can be more vulnerable because of their location, because of the sort of synergistic effects of a whole bunch of things: health inequities, lack of access to healthcare, lack of transportation, lack of money, lack of jobs and economic impact, economic development, and so forth. So there's ways in which these neighborhoods may be more vulnerable to environmental harms. Emergency planning, preparedness, and response. We talked about this previously, but if you are a elderly, low-income black woman who lives in the lower Ninth Ward, and Hurricane Katrina is coming, right? What are you doing? How are you able to prepare for that? Who's helping you with that? And I think I mentioned to you before that the whole thing about Katrina in particular was it was a total. Well, actually, I can't really say what I want to say, but it was a total mess up. How's that? But at all levels of government, right? It was a disaster not only because of the hurricane and the flooding, but because of the emergency, poor planning and poor response. And so that becomes an issue. So again, think about West Louisville. Okay, if there had to be an evacuation of West Louisville, how would that happen? Right? Seriously. Think about the number of people who live in West Louisville who do not have vehicles. Right? Think about how are they going to get medicine that they depend on, right? So these are things where there are disparate vulnerabilities. And then more generally, the disparate vulnerabilities to disaster, shocks, climate change. We're going to talk about that next class session and so forth. Okay, we're going to get partway into the laws, and then we'll finish this up on Wednesday. But the question is, it's all nice and fine to say we have this definition, we know that this is going on, but how are the laws used to address environmental justice? Well, primarily, there was a time when there were a number of lawsuits undertaken under the Equal Protection Clause and or the Due Process Clause challenging government actions for their unequal treatment or violation of substantive or procedural due process for low-income and minority groups or populations or communities and so forth. These have typically not fared very well at all. I did mention that in terms of the public facilities and infrastructure, there was some success there because the pattern was so stark that the courts could not avoid the fact that it had to be racially motivated, because why would you leave one neighborhood out of all the others, and so forth. But in general, the problem, of course, is proving intentional racial discrimination, proving that you've been deprived of life, liberty, or property, that there was not adequate process as constitutionally required, and so forth. So this has not fared very well. There have been also actions taken under federal and state civil rights statutes. Okay? These, for the most part, also have not fared very well for grassroots environmental justice groups, again because a number of these statutes have a discriminatory intent requirement. The exception is the Fair Housing Act allows for regulations for HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to adopt regulations that will scrutinize housing decisions on the basis of disparate impact. That was upheld by the Supreme Court in the Inclusive Communities case, another little nod to common law. But at the moment, there is a proposal being considered by HUD for all intents and purposes, to eliminate the disparate impact regulations, to modify it, but really it's going to be modified so much that they'll sort of go away. It's also not clear how many environmental conditions would be covered by regulations governing housing policy or housing programs. So obviously, if you are creating a public housing project where you are adopting or you are providing sort of subsidized federal housing where there are adverse environmental conditions, that might be a basis, but it's a little bit of a stretch. Much more important, much more relevant to us are federal environmental statutes and regulations. And there have been a variety of ways in which environmental justice groups have brought lawsuits challenging government actions or the actions of regulated parties under federal environmental statutes and regulations, and also an environmental justice component into that. We're going to spend some more time talking about that at the beginning of class on Wednesday. State and local laws and regulations. So this is an area where I've read and where I've actually pointed out that grassroots groups have been more successful than people think in terms of using zoning and land use laws and planning processes and so forth to reshape their communities and to address the environmental harms and land use impacts in their neighborhoods. Again, that's more for land use class next semester. Public and private nuisance actions, costly to bring, sometimes very limited remedies, but that's a possibility. The public trust doctrine is out there and at times has been used, especially when there are water resources at issue. There are a variety of participatory processes and rules that that govern, and environmental justice groups are often assertive about pushing for those opportunities to participate. Enforcement actions by government agencies, but also the extent to which grassroots groups, environmental justice groups, can bring enforcement actions through citizen suits. Okay? So again, that's against the regulated party, or use citizen suits to challenge what the government agency is doing. I'm also put up here, you don't really need to worry about this because we're not doing this in this class, but you should be aware that there have been a handful of efforts out there for environmental justice groups to try to use international law, human rights laws or other kinds of laws to challenge what's going on. And there are some people who are big fans of that, who suggest that this could be a viable avenue. I guess I don't feel qualified enough in the realm of international law to comment on, to form a definitive opinion. In general, I think that we haven't seen a lot of actual outcomes from this, so I'm a little skeptical. But again, I don't know enough about it to tell you that whether my skepticism is warranted. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk more about these kinds of analyses at the beginning of class on Wednesday. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of these other kinds of things, information, tools, etc., partnerships, funding, and talk about really how environmental justice is more about movements, outcomes, and so forth. And we'll move to climate change. Okay, so we'll talk about climate change. But again, we'll do some big picture stuff about climate change. We'll really mostly talk about, okay, what does this mean for environmental justice work in the Tampa Bay area? So try to kind of get, sort of, because otherwise climate change could be weeks of the class, and we're not going to do that. So, okay, so that's where we'll pick up on Wednesday.